Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, there will be something extra on the to-do list this Tuesday as local voters are asked to decide on a hotly contested Senate seat and on some key local elections, including in Jefferson Parish, where national unions have gotten involved in the school board races, and upstate, where Edwin Edwards attempts to return to Congress. We'll be looking at these contests tonight, as well as grading, local education, and a key ruling about teachers. We'll also look at the Louisiana way of holding elections. On the ballot for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Jeremy Alford, publisher, LawPolitics.com. Danielle Drellinger, education reporter, NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune. And Stephanie Grace, columnist, the New Orleans Advocate. And we're in the home stretch now, so we're going to talk politics first. Jeremy, what's the Senate race looking like? We saw the last debate with actually 3 contenders participating in the debate this week. How's it looking?
Which way is it leaning, right? I would say after attack ads that started before Christmas, I think we're all kind of leaning sideways. But going down the stretch, it looks like, Landrieu is leading in the primary polls from 1 to 7 points. I think it's looking more likely than ever we'll end up in a runoff, despite the Landrieu and Democrats hoping to win in the primary. The debate was very interesting. We actually saw an exchange of ideas. There were 3 candidates, but I think only 2 points of view on that panel. We saw some differences of opinion on Medicaid expansion, minimum wage. I think the most intense debates were over issues like Social Security and raising the retirement age, which is a clear sign that for both camps, elderly voters, veterans are key demographics heading into Tuesday.
And Landrieu also is really focusing on the female vote, on the women vote. Hillary Clinton is coming this weekend to campaign for her.
On Saturday, and Landrieu has held more than a dozen of these women conferences and leadership luncheons all around the state leading up to Tuesday's vote. And that's one area where she has to gain ground with white women and larger, really with white voters altogether. UNO put out a new poll this week. I think it was actually in the field last week, and she is still in the low 20s. She was with 21 with white voters. Even with an astronomical black turnout, she still has to make that number move, and the way to make it move is with elderly voters, veterans, white women, and with independents.
Early voting is finished. It's finished on October 28th.
Tuesday. Yeah.
So, what can we kind of tell from early voting? Is there any sort of reading the tea leaves at all with that?
Yeah, at least on the Democratic side, I think we had a decent turnout in New Orleans that tells us that the Democrats were mobilized there. They came about 1,000 votes short of what they really wanted to get. But in Baton Rouge and in Caddo, Shreveport, 2 areas where Landrieu has to get votes out of the minority communities there, they underperformed. I think we know that voter turnout is going to be 45 to 52%, probably on the higher end. But it outperformed 2010, but it did not outperform the presidential years. So it's definitely looking like a tough race for Mary Landrieu, no matter what. She needs
that presidential vote. That's
she
what
does,
carried
absolutely.
her even when she had a lot going for her in 2008.
Jeremy, you did an article in your newsletter suggesting that the machinery of black politics seemed to be changing and not as able to get the vote out as it used to be.
Right. And last Saturday, which was the midway point of early voting, went and looked in the 9th Ward, and it was basically a ghost town in terms of election activity. I spoke with sources who are working on these street campaigns. They're telling me that there's only about $400,000 that are dedicated to minority outreach statewide. That's a much lower figure than most people were thinking. They're working out of a headquarters off of General de Gaulle. They've only booked about 8 vans for turnout. According to my sources, that's lower than what we've seen in the past. In places like Baton Rouge and Shreveport, the groups that are in charge of minority outreach are still waiting for resources, are still waiting for money. But this generally all happens at the last minute. This also may be a sign that there could be technology that they're using to better target neighborhoods and voters. Rather than going door to door and sending a box of checks down to New Orleans before election.
One thing I've heard is from people who've been involved in this in the past is that there is real tension between the people from here and the people from national Democratic headquarters who have the technology, and it obviously worked very well in the Barack Obama election, and they're trying to replicate that. But I think there are some control issues, as I understand too,
Right.
which is interesting.
Well, the Langer camp, though, says that, watch for the normal street operation come election day.
Absolutely.
They say that we're still going to see that. They're not backing off of that.
Absolutely.
Right?
They're saying that it's going to look like it always has, but it may get energized the closer that we get to Tuesday. But I can tell you that based on what I saw last weekend, which was thought to be a warm-up to Election Day, based on the half dozen sources I've interviewed from Shreveport, Baton Rouge, and from New Orleans, that things definitely look different right now, that money is not being spread out to the community groups like they have in the past. There's Ben Jefferson, the former chief of staff for Edwin Edwards, has been hired by the party to handle minority outreach. He's serving as a kind of the chief allocator. So it's a different look, it's a different feel. They contend that that's just perception, that come Election Day it'll look like it always has. So it's something I'm definitely keeping an eye on and I'm interested in.
But one thing that is different, maybe not from the last election, but from a decade or so ago, are some of the big name groups in black politics, the Soul, Coup, Bold, those type of organizations. Bill Jefferson Street operations, not there, at least I don't think it's there anymore. I mean, isn't that going to be a factor? Isn't there less activity on the street level, or maybe it's still there but less visible?
Well, it's been happening for quite a number of years, really going back to the Nagin election, and certainly accelerated by Katrina and the prosecutions. Of course, Bill Jefferson's organization doesn't exist anymore. The person to watch here, I think, and also in Baton Rouge to some extent, is Cedric Richmond, who is kind of the heir to all of those groups, and he's got an organization. He's playing in the state races, the congressional races, also the local races. And I think he kind of has in mind to be the next kingmaker, or whatever you want to call him. So.
And that sort of moves us into the congressional races, because we have a couple, not here in New Orleans necessarily, but the 5th and the 6th that are interesting races. So what are you finding there?
It's interesting. They're both... they're similar in one sense because there is a dominant Democrat in each case, but they're Republican districts, and there are a bunch of Republican candidates. So we're really looking at whoever wins, probably whichever Republican gets in against the Democrat in each district will be the winner, unless something unusual happens. We've got some personalities, I should say. Start with the 6th district. Edwin Edwards. I went out campaigning with him this week because I thought it would be fun, and it was great. It was a show. Is it a campaign? Not really. He says it is. People were so happy to see him, and it's been interesting watching him go into these really conservative areas in the 6th district, and you think, he's a Democrat. He has the felony conviction. He has the reputation that people don't want perpetuated in this state. But they're so happy to see him, and the stacks of cell phone cameras, and everyone has the book for him to sign. And he went in. He was going around the city hall at Denham Springs the other day, and he walked into the city attorney's office. She had a picture of herself with him from 1998 up on the wall. She also had a poster that was actually from an old Times-Picayune graphic from dating back to his trial. So it wasn't even flattering of him, but she was big hug. He went around. He promised everybody a raise. He made off-color jokes.
So he doesn't seem to have lost much of a beat there.
And again,
he's 87 years old.
87 years old. He loves doing this. He does not seem 87 except for maybe the hearing, which he's having a little trouble with. And this is a different guy than we saw in that reality show where he admits now that was horrible. It was embarrassing. Trina regrets it. I did it for her, but she regrets it. But this is Edwin in his element, and it's kind of I think of it as a farewell tour, really.
And you had a quote from Bob DeHemicourt in your newsletter about
Edwin. That is the only thing that he knows how to do.
Yeah.
And this is Edwards in his element because he's coasting towards victory. Mm-hmm. This is the guarantee of the election cycle. Edwards is going to lead the primary. He's going to make it into the runoff. However, I've been thinking, let's think back on all of Edwin Edwards' elections. There was one election in particular that he knew at the very beginning that he was going to lose. Buddy Romer race, and what did he do? He dropped out. Heading into the primary, probably he's going to end up with a Republican who's out polling him. All the runoff scenarios we've seen has him losing practically every single one. But the field right now, if you had to stack it, really all eyes are on Garrett Graves. This is a guy who is the former coastal director for Governor Bobby Jindal. He has raised $1.2 million in this race. His closest opponent has $500,000. He's outpaced every non-incumbent congressional candidate around the state. He's raising money at the same clip of Cedric Richmond in New Orleans, a sitting congressman. So if he loses that second spot in the runoff, his campaign will immediately become a textbook example of how not to spend $1.2 million.
Right. And he's had some real tension now with another Republican in the race, Dan Claytor, who's a sitting state senator. They probably are the top two of the large field, and they're really going at each other right now.
And either of them could really slip in there.
They could, because Claytor's ran a much less aggressive campaign, and he actually had a tragedy in the middle of it. His mother passed away in a car accident. But he is a sitting state senator. He represents that district that Bill Cassidy came from, the incumbent. 17% of the voters have already elected him, so that's an advantage.
5th district.
Vance McAllister. It could happen, I have to say. Who would have thought? He's, of course, the Republican congressman who was elected a year ago in a special election against the establishment Bobby Jindal, candidate who the special election was kind of designed to help, and it really did backfire. And then a couple months later, he gets caught on camera kissing his married aide, and it's leaked all over the place. And Bobby Jindal, who never liked him anyway, calls on him to drop out, and he says, no, I'm going to serve out the end of my term and then leave. And then he changes his mind, and he's out there running. And I have to say, he has handled the situation as well as anybody could. He's really he's being kind of self-effacing about it. He goes out to meetings. He brings it up before anybody else does. He kind of makes jokes about it.
What are the polls saying right now?
I was given 2 internal polls this week, and both of them show McAllister dropping. I interviewed his campaign yesterday. They had decided not to go back up on TV before Tuesday. However, they told me that they have changed their mind. They're going to be back on broadcast Saturday morning. And that may include, he may have to go into his own pockets again to pay for those ads.
Which he can do.
He's already put up $400,000 this year. He put up $410,000 last year. And he may be going back into his pockets to go back up on TV next year.
So quickly, the other two who are sort of they're sort of bunched together because we're just about
Ralph
time
Abraham, who's a physician running a very strong campaign. Also Zach Dasher, who's the designated Duck Dynasty candidate, because that's what happens in this district. Of course, the Duck Dynasty people were with McAllister last time.
And I would watch for Dasher to surge, possibly. He's got robocalls coming from Ted Cruz over the weekend. He'll be on Sean Hannity Monday night. Duck Dynasty ads through Tuesday.
So that's a tight one to watch for Tuesday.
Very tight,
okay, thanks a lot. All right, over to Danielle right now. And schools and teachers were given some grades. Well, the evaluations and then also school performance results released this week by the state.
Right, so this month it's the school performance scores and the letter grade. So people think of it as like the report card for the state schools. And they're always they're the number one metric that people look at with the schools. For New Orleans, people look at it to say, are the schools improving? Did all the changes after Katrina make a difference? For parents, they're looking at their own school, their kid's school, like, no one wants to send their kid to a D school or an F school.
So it's like A through F of the grades.
It's A through F. There's also, it's A through F. And they also, again, in New Orleans, is an especially big deal because persistently failing schools anywhere in the state can be taken over by the state. But here in New Orleans, where so many of the schools are state-authorized charters anyway, if they don't have good grades, they can lose their charter. They can be shut down. And also on the other side of that, schools that do well, that are an RSD, can vote to return to the Orleans Parish School Board.
So what is the status of that? Are we seeing more schools who perhaps could make the decision? None have made so far to go back.
No school has decided yet to go back. But yeah, this year there's something like, I believe over half the RSD charters are eligible to vote to return.
Is the sense that some of them might?
There is this year. Last year there was like one school that people thought might return, which was Morris Jeff, and no one did. And the factors that people cited in the past haven't changed. For instance, 1 year later there is no superintendent.
Yeah.
But this time there's enough schools that are smaller, that are not really in the education reform clique, that people are thinking that there is a possibility that some of them will listen to parents, might make a different decision.
What would be the argument for wanting to return, especially looking at the track record in the past?
Yeah, I think that, that's one of the things that people say. It's like they can stay with the recovery school district as long as they want. If they want to, that's what the state has decided. So, like, what's the advantage for going? It doesn't really
And they're
seem to
charter
be one.
schools,
And they're
too,
charter
right?
schools,
And
so they run most things independently.
And it's up to the charter board?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's not actually the principal, it's not the parents, it's the charter board, the nonprofit board that runs the school.
And now teacher evaluation, we got reports on that too.
Right, on consecutive days, which I believe they will never do again. The most important thing to know about teacher evaluations is they really don't have anything to do with how well the school is performing. I think they seem to be a pretty frustrating set of grades because almost all of this teacher evaluation score comes from within the school. Half of it is observations made by the school administrators, which, you know, the state has like a checklist and they do some training, but it's really up to individual schools. And then most of the time the academic targets that kids are supposed to hit are also set by the schools. So some schools grade harshly, some don't. And even though in most of the state these grades are a pretty big deal because if it's a teacher who is at the bottom year after year is going to be the first in line to be laid off.
Right.
But here, people don't have tenure anyway.
But you wrote in your columns, you did write about some schools where the evaluations were at the highest level, but the school performance grade was at the lowest.
Yep, that happened to several schools, and the other way around, schools that had B letter grades and their teachers were all like put in the incompetent category.
And they just do it themselves. They don't hire any sort of outside evaluator. It's actually school staff that judges themselves and creates these reports.
Yeah, and I mean the idea is that's supposed to be, and Superintendent John White has been pitching this far, rather than being like a punitive measure that could get you fired, they pitch it as like it's for the development of teachers. It's, you can see what you're doing well and what you're not doing well.
And like you said, they probably won't do this again, just back it up one day after the other, because this is a lot of information to process. It really can get kind of confusing. Thanks a lot, Danielle. All right, let's go over to Errol now. And you wanted to talk about how Louisiana conducts elections. How do we do it?
People always joke about Louisiana. There's always these jokes about, in Plaquemines Parish, people who were deceased voted, or in St. Bernard Parish, people voted in alphabetical order on the rolls, that sort of thing. But a lot of that's just probably urban legends. I think some of it probably goes back to the days of the Perez dynasty. But the fact is, when it comes to elections, I'm talking about the process of gathering and counting the votes that Louisiana is pretty good at. I'm not talking about the campaigning. Okay, the campaigning is a whole other category. But just the whole process of counting the votes that we've been fairly efficient at. I think there are a couple of things that distinguish Louisiana. One is that we were one of the very first, perhaps the first state in the country to have total voting machines in every precinct. Back when a lot of states were still having paper ballots, and remember the George Bush count in Florida with the hanging chads? Mm-hmm. People in Louisiana were just so smug about, I mean, how far ahead we were over the state of Florida, and so we've had electronic voting for a long time, really the first, and now we have this computerized voting where it all goes to a central bank, which is really unusual among states. And so that's one thing that distinguishes. It's really hard to stuff the ballot boxes because there's no ballot box. But the other thing is our system of Saturday elections. Most states still have Tuesday elections, which is the federal model, and that goes back to the 1700s when an act of Congress, they said, well, we don't want to have an election on the Sabbath, we don't want to have an election in the middle of the week because people are going to market, so let's have elections on Tuesday, and they settled on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And the states have pretty much followed that, but a good argument could be made in terms of having elections on Saturdays, and it was Errol Long, when he was governor, who pushed for that. I think he was saying, well, more farmers can get it, but not just farmers, but people who are working. I mean, have more time. And, Tuesday's a work day for people, and and some unions have said, well, look, if you can make Tuesday an election day, then it should be a holiday so people have chances. But if you really give it analysis, Saturday is probably a sensible way to do it. There are some countries that do Saturday. United States tends to be mostly on Tuesdays. Some states have some elections on Tuesdays, on Saturdays. The only time you see a Tuesday election in Louisiana is once every 4 years with the federal election dates, and every other date, including the runoff for these races, is on a Saturday.
And of course, we have a Tuesday election coming up this Tuesday, November 4th. And aside from the congressional race and the Senate race, we have some local races too.
We do. We have a bunch. Around the area, start off in St. Tammany Parish, because there obviously is an election for district attorney. And you know, it's in a way, it's like the Senate race where kind of the dominant character is President Obama, who's not on the ballot. In St. Tammany, the dominant character is Walter Reed, the outgoing DA, who's under federal investigation, who's not on the ballot. And really, the campaign is about, I think, who's going to bring the most change. There are a couple of lawyers running. There's a guy named Brian Traynor who probably is most likely to get one of the runoff spots, people think. He works for Jack Strain, the sheriff. Some people supporting his opponent have kind of, accused him of being part of the good old boy network because of his connections, but it's pretty heated. Again, there will be a runoff. There's a lawyer named Roy Burns. There's Warren Montgomery. There's actually a little bit of a Hollywood angle here. There's a young actor named Ian Somerhalder who's in Vampire Diaries, who is from St. Tammany as an endorsed candidate called Alan Black. So whatever that means. But we're looking at a runoff on that.
In Jefferson Parish, the big elections are the school board elections, and there are a bunch of individual fights, and there are some big characters, as we know, on that school board. Sometimes they end up in court with each other. But the overall storyline is basically who will control the school board. Right now, there is a business-backed slate that came in 4 years ago, and they're allied with the superintendent, James Meza, who's on his way out, and they are really, they would call themselves reform. I know that's a loaded word, but they are pro-Common Core. They have some very good numbers in terms of metrics and how the schools are doing. They've had a very adversarial relationship with the teachers union. So this year, the teachers union is running a slate. And the interesting thing that happened this week is the national AFT, the National Teachers Union, has put in $446,000, which is way beyond the amount anybody was spending in a school board election to try to tilt it to their side. Of course, one of the things that's happened is there isn't a collective bargaining agreement. I mean, it's been a lot of internal politics, but so there's a lot of canvassing going on. There's a lot of online advertising, and the business people are making sure everybody understands that the national union has put this money in. So that will be interesting. Is it in every seat for the school board? All seats are up for re-election?
Yes, all seats are up. There isn't necessarily a union versus business dynamic in each seat, but in a number of them.
One of the most heated ones has to be Larry Dale and Melody Munch, right?
Yes, because she is, of course, the former president of the union.
Right.
So,
and
he's one of the leaders of the other contingent.
Of the business group,
yes.
Right. It's talking about teachers. I'm going to go over to Danielle. There was a ruling today from the state Supreme Court regarding a suit filed by teachers who were dismissed after Katrina.
Right, and so this came down about an hour ago.
Wow.
So this has been a very big lawsuit. About 7,600 Orleans Parish School Board employees were fired after Katrina, and it was a very painful situation. People had lost their homes. They are suddenly told that they don't have a job, like, sorry, this is it. And then the state takeover of almost all the city schools happened, and so then there were no jobs for them to come back to. And so it's become now, first of all, the financial ramifications are huge, because both the local and the appeals courts ruled in favor of the teachers, and the estimates for damages were as high as $1.5 billion.
And which would have had to have been paid by...
Well, they brought that's part of the question, is whether the state was also going to be found liable. I've been told that there was no expectation that all of this would ever actually get paid, but it's certainly an eye-popping figure. But also, it's been like this flashpoint for the ongoing tensions over the state takeover and the people who feel disenfranchised over it. A lot of black middle class strength, I've been told, is due to people having those jobs. And so, like, emotionally speaking, it's been a very big deal. And the Supreme Court just said they threw the case out.
Across the board. On all points.
Because there was already a union settlement in this, which they decided was, the issues have been settled by that agreement, and there's no case here to argue. But more than that, they said even if the case were still valid here, they agreed with the Orleans Parish School Board and with the state lawyers.
Okay, and so that was what, 7,500 teachers? You said?
7,600.
7,600 teachers represented. Okay, Danielle, thanks. One quick question for you guys before we go to looking ahead segment. Polling this go around, was it impacted a little bit?
Well, I interviewed a group of pollsters last week, and they all told me that they are unable to get polls in the field right now. That if someone calls them, and they said it this week too, they're having to turn business down because the interviewing firms, these are the companies that actually get on the phone, dial the numbers, interview the people, are overbooked. And it's not because there are so many campaigns or they're so heated. It's because we have more national interest than ever in the form of super PACs, independent expenditures, outside groups who really don't know what's going on in Louisiana. They're not from here, and so they're having to poll to find out. One local pollster in Baton Rouge told me that they got more money than political sense. So
is this impacting the polling numbers at all?
I don't think so. I think everyone who had their tracking pre-scheduled and they're fine. But anyone who wants to go in the field right now, fresh, is going to be sadly disappointed.
Okay, thanks a lot. Now, looking ahead, Errol.
We know the moment that's always been celebrated as the end of World War I in 1918 was November 11th at 11 a.m. So 11, 11, and 11. So that's always been a big ceremonial moment. This year at 11, 11, and 11, there's going to be a rededication of this Doughboy statue that for many years stood on South Galvez in Tulane. It was taken away for construction of the medical center. It's been restored since then, and it's going to be within the medical center at Tulane and Galvez, and they're bringing it back all fixed up and nice, and it's going to be 11 o'clock on November 11th.
Very nice. Thanks, Errol. Jeremy.
I am looking forward to seeing how these PSC races turn out. In North Louisiana's Foster Campbell, one of the last true populist Democrats in the state. He's opposed by business and industry, but it looks like he'll probably pull it out. And in South Louisiana, closer to home, Eric Scrimmetta and Forrest Wright look like they could possibly be positioned for a runoff, but Scrimmetta could pull it out. It's got a big bank account. We'll see.
That's Public Service Commission, right?
Public Service Commission.
Danielle.
So this is a very simple thing that I'm looking forward to. I want to see the political costumes tonight. What are people going to dress up as? Is everyone going to say, forget it, I'm dressing up as like an Ebola virus instead? I want to see if people have some funny costumes.
And you are going to be?
Kale.
Kale. We will have kale in New Orleans. Danielle is kale.
Okay. We were talking about the Lander Get Out the Vote effort. One person who's been very involved is her brother Mitch, the mayor of New Orleans. What's interesting is he's been doing it in New Orleans, but he's also been going around the state to Lafayette and Baton Rouge, interviews, rallies. It's interesting because, of course, following the Senate race is the governor race, so you have to wonder, is he kind of seeing whether people remember him from when he was lieutenant governor, how they react to him? I think that's something to watch.
Testing the waters
Testing the waters, maybe?
All right. Thanks, you guys, for being here, and thank you all for joining us. Have fun trick-or-treating and a safe Halloween night, and we'll see you next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.